Retirement in America was once understood as an ending, a moment when work stopped and stability began. It was built into the national imagination as a reward for decades of effort, a promise that the system would hold when the body no longer could. That promise is quietly breaking. Across the country, millions of Americans are approaching old age without the financial security that retirement assumes. Savings are thin or non-existent, costs continue to rise, work does not end when expected. What was designed as a final phase of life is increasingly becoming a prolonged struggle to remain afloat. This is not a crisis defined by a single collapse or a sudden shock. It unfolds slowly, unevenly, and mostly out of sight. People fall into it one by one, navigating the consequences privately, often without recognition or support. The absence of drama has allowed the problem to grow deeper, embedding itself into the structure of everyday life. This story is not about individual failure. It is about a system that has shifted risk downward while offering fewer protections in return. A system where retirement no longer guarantees rest, and survival itself becomes uncertain. To understand how this happened and why so many find themselves with no way out, we need to look beyond assumptions and into the mechanics of the modern American retirement system. For decades, retirement in America was framed as a reward. It was the final chapter after a lifetime of work, a period defined by rest, stability, and a sense that the system had done what it promised. You worked, you contributed, and in return, you were supposed to step away from labor without fear. That story shaped generations of expectations, but today, that story is quietly collapsing. More than 35 million Americans are approaching retirement age with no savings, no pension, and no meaningful financial buffer. This number is often presented as a statistic, but it is not just a large figure on a chart. It is a systemic condition affecting millions of households at the same time. These are not people who failed in isolation. They are people entering the final stage of their working lives without protection, without leverage, and without a clear way forward. Retirement in this reality is no longer a life stage. It is a financial risk. The absence of savings means there is no margin for error. One unexpected expense, one health issue, or one economic downturn can immediately destabilize an entire household. Without a pension or sufficient assets, retirement stops being about rest and becomes about survival. The question is no longer when someone chooses to stop working, but whether they can afford to stop at all. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged gradually as the economic ground beneath workers changed. Wages failed to keep pace with the cost of living. Housing became more expensive, healthcare more unpredictable, and everyday expenses more difficult to manage. For many Americans, the ability to set aside money for the future was slowly eroded, not by irresponsibility, but by necessity. Retirement savings became optional in theory and impossible in practice. The scale of the problem matters. When tens of millions of people reach retirement age without financial security, the issue is no longer personal. It becomes structural. It reveals a system that increasingly transfers long-term risk onto individuals while offering fewer tools to manage that risk. As a result, retirement has been redefined. It is no longer a period of financial stability earned through decades of contribution. It is a moment of exposure, where income drops but costs remain, and where choices become constrained rather than expanded. For millions of Americans, retirement is not about stepping away from work. It is about continuing to work as long as the body allows, simply to avoid falling into financial free fall. This is the core reality behind the number. 35 million Americans with nothing is not just a warning about the future. It is a description of the present. A retirement system that once promised security now leaves millions standing at the edge, facing a stage of life that was supposed to offer peace, but instead demands endurance. Social Security was never designed to be the foundation of retirement in America. From the beginning, it functioned as a safety net, a baseline layer of protection meant to prevent extreme poverty in old age. It was intended to supplement other sources of income, not replace them. The system assumed that retirees would also have savings, pensions, or assets to rely on. That assumption no longer holds. Today, Social Security has quietly transformed from a supporting structure into a lifeline. For millions of older Americans, it is no longer one income stream among several. It is the only one. When the monthly deposit arrives, it determines whether rent is paid, whether medication is filled, and whether basic expenses are covered. There is no backup plan behind it. There is no secondary cushion waiting if it falls short. This shift has created a dangerous dependency. Social Security benefits were never calibrated to fully sustain a household in a high-cost economy. The average monthly payment reflects a different era, one with lower housing costs, cheaper healthcare, and fewer financial pressures on retirees. As living expenses rise, the gap between what Social Security provides and what retirees actually need continues to widen. Cost of living adjustments, known as COLA, are often presented as proof that the system adapts to inflation, but these adjustments rarely reflect the real expenses that dominate retirees' budgets. Housing costs, especially rent, have risen far faster than benefit increases. Medical expenses, including prescriptions, insurance premiums, and long-term care needs, consume a growing share of fixed incomes. Even when benefits increase on paper, purchasing power often declines in practice. The result is a form of structural fragility. Retirees dependent on Social Security have little flexibility and almost no margin for error. A small increase in rent or healthcare costs can destabilize an entire financial balance. There is no room to absorb shocks, no ability to delay expenses, and no realistic way to generate new income without returning to work. Stability becomes conditional, renewed month by month, payment by payment. This fragility reshapes what retirement looks like. Instead of planning years ahead, many retirees plan weeks ahead. Instead of long-term security, they manage short-term survival. The system was not built for this level of reliance, and the consequences are visible in daily trade-offs. Skipping medical appointments, delaying repairs, cutting food budgets, or moving into less stable housing situations. What makes this crisis especially difficult to confront is its invisibility. Social Security still functions. Payments still arrive. There is no sudden collapse, no dramatic breaking point, but beneath the surface, dependence on a single limited income stream erodes resilience. Retirement becomes less about financial independence and more about financial exposure. Social Security was meant to catch people if they fell. It was not meant to be the ground they stand on. Yet for millions of Americans, that is exactly what it has become. When a safety net turns into a lifeline, it signals not individual failure, but a system stretched far beyond its original purpose, holding together a retirement reality that grows more fragile with every passing year. For much of the 20th century, retirement risk in America did not rest on the individual worker. It was absorbed by institutions. Large companies offered defined benefit pensions that promised a predictable income for life. The responsibility to manage investment risk, market volatility, and long-term funding was carried by the employer. Workers did not need to understand financial markets to retire with stability. They needed only to remain employed long enough to qualify. That structure no longer defines retirement in America. Over time, responsibility has shifted almost entirely away from corporations and onto individuals. Defined benefit pensions were gradually replaced by defined contribution plans such as 401ks and IRAs. On paper, this transition was framed as flexibility and personal choice. In practice, it marked a fundamental transfer of risk. What companies once guaranteed, workers are now expected to manage alone. Under the current system, retirement outcomes depend heavily on individual contributions, market performance, and timing. Workers must decide how much to save, where to invest, and when to adjust their portfolios, often without professional guidance. The system assumes consistent income, financial literacy, and long-term stability. For many Americans, none of those conditions exist. The problem is not that people refuse to save, it is that saving has become increasingly difficult within the realities of modern wages and expenses. Wage growth has stagnated while housing, healthcare, insurance, and education costs have steadily increased. Each paycheck is stretched thinner than the last. Retirement contributions are frequently the first thing reduced or suspended when budgets tighten, not out of neglect, but out of necessity. Investment-based retirement also introduces a form of timing risk that did not exist under traditional pensions. Market performance matters most near the end of a career, when workers have the least time to recover from losses. A major downturn at age 55 or 60 can erase decades of accumulated savings. At that point, there is no realistic way to rebuild. Contributions cannot be increased enough, and time cannot be extended without physical and emotional cost. This vulnerability exposes a harsh reality. Retirement security is no longer tied primarily to years of service or commitment to a company. It is tied to market conditions beyond any individual's control. Workers can do everything right and still find themselves financially exposed if economic conditions turn against them at the wrong moment. The shift from corporate pensions to individual accounts has also fragmented retirement outcomes. Instead of a shared standard of post-work stability, retirement has become uneven and unpredictable. Some benefit from favorable markets and strong earnings. Others, often equally diligent, face shortfalls driven by forces they cannot influence. The system rewards timing as much as effort, and sometimes more. What was once a collective responsibility has become a personal burden. Risk that was once pooled and managed at scale is now distributed across millions of individuals, each expected to navigate complex financial systems alone. This transformation did not eliminate retirement insecurity, it relocated it, embedding it directly into the lives of workers and tying their future stability to markets that offer no guarantees. In this environment, retirement is no longer a promise made by institutions. It is a gamble carried by individuals, one that becomes more dangerous the closer they get to the end of their working lives. The inability to save for retirement in America is often framed as a personal failure, a matter of discipline or lifestyle choices. But this framing ignores a quieter, more persistent force at work. For millions of households, the problem is not excessive spending. It is the steady expansion of basic living costs that leaves little room for anything else. Housing sits at the center of this pressure. Rent has risen faster than wages in many parts of the country, consuming a growing share of monthly income. For renters, there is no finish line where payments end. Each year brings new increases, often disconnected from income growth. Saving becomes increasingly difficult when housing alone absorbs such a large and unpredictable portion of earnings. Healthcare adds another layer of strain. Insurance premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs continue to rise, even for those who remain employed. A single medical event can disrupt financial plans for years. For many families, healthcare expenses are not occasional surprises, but recurring obligations that must be prioritized over long-term savings. Education and medical debt further compound the problem. Student loans follow workers well into midlife, competing directly with retirement contributions. Medical debt, often incurred without choice, lingers long after treatment ends. These obligations reduce disposable income not temporarily, but permanently, reshaping financial trajectories over decades rather than months. Within this environment, saving becomes an act of trade-offs rather than planning. Each month presents a choice between present stability and future security. Retirement contributions are delayed, reduced, or eliminated to manage immediate needs. This is not a reflection of indifference toward the future. It is a rational response to financial pressure in the present. What makes this erosion particularly damaging is its gradual nature. There is no single moment when saving becomes impossible. Instead, the capacity to save is worn down over time, chipped away by rising expenses and stagnant income. By the time workers reach their later years, the cumulative effect becomes clear, not because they failed to plan, but because the room to plan was steadily taken from them. The cost of living crisis does not announce itself as a retirement issue. It presents itself as rent due, insurance bills, loan payments, and medical statements. But over decades, these recurring pressures reshape outcomes. They turn the desire to save into a constant negotiation, one that too often ends with sacrifice. In this context, the retirement crisis is not driven by reckless behavior. It is driven by a system in which basic stability consumes nearly all available resources. When survival costs rise faster than income, saving for the future becomes less a matter of choice and more a matter of privilege. The American retirement story is increasingly divided by generation. Baby boomers were the last group to enter the workforce at scale when long-term stability was still structurally supported. Many had access to employer pensions, affordable housing, and a labor market that rewarded loyalty with predictable benefits. Not every boomer retired comfortably, but the pathway existed in a way it no longer does today. For Generation X and Millennials, the conditions are fundamentally different. These generations are expected to work longer, remain flexible, and adapt continuously to shifting economic demands. Careers are less linear, employment is more fragmented, and long-term contracts have been replaced by short-term arrangements. Stability has been traded for flexibility, often without the protections that once accompanied traditional employment. The rise of contract work and the gig economy has further weakened retirement security. Benefits such as pensions, healthcare coverage, and employer-matched retirement retirement contributions are frequently absent. Workers shoulder more responsibility while receiving fewer guarantees. Income may be earned consistently, but it is rarely secured over the long term. This instability makes planning difficult and saving unpredictable. At the same time, productivity has increased. Workers are more connected, more responsive, and more efficient than previous generations. Technology has compressed workloads and expanded expectations, yet the financial rewards of this productivity have not translated into greater security. Instead, the gains have been unevenly distributed, leaving many workers with higher output but lower protection. Housing plays a critical role in this generational divide. Earlier generations benefited from lower entry costs and rising home values, turning ownership into a long-term asset. For younger generations, high prices and tight markets delay or prevent home ownership altogether. Without that asset base, financial vulnerability persists well into later life. The result is a paradox. Gen X and millennials are contributing more labor over longer periods, often into older age, while facing greater uncertainty about their financial future. The promise that hard work would lead to stability has weakened. Retirement is postponed not out of ambition, but out of necessity. This generational shift is not driven by individual choices alone. It reflects structural changes in how work is organized, compensated, and protected. The expectation to work longer now exists alongside a declining capacity to build lasting security. For many, the future holds more years of labor, but fewer assurances that those years will lead to a stable retirement. Ironically, the most productive generations in modern history are also among the most financially exposed. They are asked to carry more risk, manage more uncertainty, and extend their working lives, all while receiving less support than those who came before them. Homeownership is rarely discussed as part of retirement planning, yet in the United States it functions as a form of hidden security. A paid-off home reduces monthly expenses, stabilizes housing costs, and provides a buffer against rising living expenses. For many retirees, this stability makes the difference between managing on a fixed income and falling into financial distress. Retirement without home ownership removes that buffer entirely. Renters carry housing costs into old age with no endpoint. Unlike a mortgage, rent does not disappear after decades of payments. It continues indefinitely, often increasing year after year. For retirees whose income is fixed or declining, this creates a structural imbalance. Housing costs rise while income remains static. This imbalance compounds over time. Even modest annual rent increases accumulate into significant financial pressure. What begins as a manageable payment can slowly consume a growing share of monthly income. As other costs such as healthcare and insurance increase, renters are forced to make difficult trade-offs. Housing, the most essential expense, crowds out nearly everything else. In contrast, homeowners who enter retirement with little or no mortgage experience a fundamentally different reality. Their housing costs are more predictable and often significantly lower. Property taxes and maintenance remain, but they do not escalate in the same way as rent. This stability allows limited retirement income to stretch further, providing resilience against inflation and unexpected expenses. The absence of homeownership also limits options in times of crisis. Renters have fewer ways to reduce expenses without uprooting their lives. Downsizing is often constrained by market conditions, and moving frequently carries financial and emotional costs. Without equity, there is no asset to draw from, no financial lever to pull when income falls short. This vulnerability is particularly dangerous in high-cost rental markets, where retirees compete with working-age tenants for limited housing. Fixed incomes offer little protection in environments shaped by rising demand and investor-driven pricing. In the United States, owning a home has quietly become a form of retirement insurance. It is not labeled as such, but its impact is undeniable. Those who own benefit from stability that extends far beyond shelter. Those who do not face a retirement landscape that is far more fragile, exposed to cost increases they cannot outpace. A retirement without a home is not merely less comfortable, it is structurally more dangerous. It places older Americans in a position where their largest expense remains volatile, while their ability to respond steadily declines. In this environment, housing insecurity becomes one of the most serious and least acknowledged threats to financial stability in old age. The image of retirement as a period of rest is quietly disappearing from American life. In its place, a new reality has emerged, one that is rarely acknowledged openly. More older Americans are working well into their 70s, not to stay active or socially engaged, but because they have no viable alternative. Work has become a requirement for survival, not a choice for fulfillment. Part-time jobs in retail, food service, and delivery have become common among older workers. Driving passengers, stocking shelves, standing for long hours, and performing physically demanding tasks are no longer unusual sights. These roles are often unstable, low-paying, and physically taxing, yet they provide the immediate income needed to cover basic expenses. The work continues not because it is sustainable, but because stopping is not an option. This shift reflects a deeper transformation in how retirement functions. The absence of sufficient savings, pensions, or affordable healthcare forces many seniors to remain in the labor force long after traditional retirement age. Physical limitations increase, recovery slows, and health risks rise, but economic pressure overrides these realities. The body becomes the final asset left to draw from. What makes this trend especially difficult to confront is how it is framed. Older workers are often described as choosing to remain active or productive. This narrative obscures the underlying coercion. For many, continued work is not a preference, but a necessity driven by rent, medical costs, and everyday living expenses that do not pause with age. The normalization of late-life labor also shifts expectations across society. Working into old age becomes quietly accepted, reducing pressure to address the underlying failures of the retirement system. What was once considered a warning sign is reframed as resilience. The system adapts by lowering standards rather than restoring security. As retirement becomes increasingly unattainable, it begins to resemble a luxury rather than a universal phase of life. Those with substantial assets, home ownership, or high incomes can still step away from work. For everyone else, retirement is postponed indefinitely. The divide is not based on effort, but on access to stability accumulated earlier in life. In this environment, the concept of retirement loses its original meaning. It is no longer a shared expectation built into the life cycle. It becomes an outcome reserved for a shrinking segment of the population. Working until death is not openly declared as policy, but in practice, it is becoming the default for those left without alternatives.